just welcome if you're new here. I'm Carmen Fourie. I'm an employment relations practitioner and I'm also the director of Fourie Employment Relations. I have included a list of my credentials in the description below to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. Today's topic, I'm going to be discussing section 189, but in particular the section 189.3 letter of retrenchment. So who is this video for? I'm going to speak like it is for employers who are drafting the section 183 letter, but of course any practitioners that are drafting this letter will possibly gain some value from this. I'm going to take it through as a step-by-step of how to complete the section 189.3 letter and any tips and recommendations that I have that I've picked up just through the years of doing a lot of these cases. But although I'm going to be discussing it like it is aimed at employers or practitioners, any employees watching this can also possibly gain some value by gaining a greater understanding of what the requirements are for the section 189.3 letter. And if you have received a section 189.3 letter and you are confused as to some of the points, why are they on there, and the information might look a bit strange, like it's not applicable to your business, then this video can also be helpful for any employees who want to get a better understanding of the retrenchment letter that they have received. Let's get straight into it. What is the section 189.3 letter? I'm going to provide a very general, quick background, but if an employer contemplates retrenching one or more employees or dismissing them due to operational requirements, and just a reminder that the term redundancy is often used. Redundancy is a type of retrenchment or a type of dismissal related to operational requirements, so it would also fall under what we are discussing today. So if an employer contemplates dismissing one or more employees, they need to invite the employees to the consultation process. The retrenchment is a consultation process whereby certain points are discussed. I will be discussing the points that need to be consulted on as per the Labor Relations Act section 189(2) a little bit later on in this video. Now, the point of a consultation process is, and specifically I'm taking wording from the Act now, is for it to be a meaningful joint consensus seeking process whereby the parties attempt to reach consensus on certain points. Again, those points I'm going to discuss a little bit later on in this video. So for this video, I'm going to use the word employees, but when I say employees, I'm referring to any representative of those employees. The Act does provide details on who the consulting party needs to be, and I've included a link below to a blog piece where I wrote exactly what that would mean and who you would need to invite to consult based on whether or not those parties are in your business. For the consultation to be a meaningful process, the consulting party would need to have a certain information, and that's where the retrenchment letter comes in. Section 189.3 states that when an employer is contemplating dismissals for operational requirements, the employer needs to send the consulting party a written letter inviting them to consult, and this written letter needs to detail specific information. And that brings us to the section 189.3 letter. I'm going to go through the 10 points that are listed in the Labor Relations Act that need to be included on the retrenchment letter, but I'm also going to provide some recommendations from my side based on experience of things that I think are useful or a good idea to include. If you would like to use my template for the retrenchment letter, I've included a list below, and on our downloads website for a small fee, you can download my retrenchment letter template and then follow along with this video to complete the parts that are specific to your organization. It might just require a little bit more work from your side, but you can still watch this video and draft your own template and then include the information that I'm going to discuss in this video. So the first thing is starting the letter. Of course, you will include the date on which you're giving them the letter, to who this is, so include the person's name, or if you know who their representative is, then you're going to send it directly to the employee's representative, and then a heading or a subject. When it comes to the subject or the title of the letter, I recommend sticking to wording that is similar to that which is used in the Act, where it says something like an invitation to consult regarding contemplated dismissals related to operational requirements. A reminder to use phrasing like contemplated or possible rather than to use wording that implies that the decision has already been made or finalized. This is not in the Act, but I recommend giving a bit of an introduction. My template has a generic introduction that I like to include that you can then alter slightly to fit the specific circumstances of your business or the situation that you're currently dealing with. Now, my first big recommendation, and this one I learned through doing a lot of retrenchments, and in the beginning I didn't include this on my letters, and that's why I learned this. It is a requirement from the Labor Relations Act that these 10 points or this information needs to be provided to the other party. But oftentimes when I didn't include this, which I'm going to tell you about now, I would get a lot of resistance where employees or their representatives would say, well, it looks like you've already decided on the outcome. What is there to talk about? Look at all this information. It looks like you have already finalized it. So for that reason, I started including a sentence or two to ensure that the party knows that there are no final decisions that have been made. None of the outcomes have been finalized. And the point is to consult and to discuss on these points. And the reason that this information is detailed on this document is because it is a requirement of the Act to assist with it being a meaningful consultation process. Since I've included it on my retrenchment invitations, I have found that I've received less resistance to the consultation process and a higher degree of cooperation. Of course, it is a difficult process to go through, so getting some resistance is really not out of the ordinary and is understandable. Now, once all that information is there, I detail the 10 points, starting with them and in order that they are in the Labor Relations Act. And just a reminder that Section 189.3 states that this is the 10 points that must be included in this, but it is not limited to these 10 points. If there is any other relevant information that in any way impacts on the retrenchment or the consultation process, remember to include that as well. Let's begin with the first one, and that is the reason for the proposed dismissal. We are here discussing retrenchments or dismissals related to operational requirements. What that means is that it is not related to the employee's individual behavior, nor is it related to their conduct or their capacity or their ability at all. Retrenchments are considered no-fault terminations, meaning it is not the employee's fault, and that the reason for it is to do with the operational requirements, the requirements of the business. These requirements are usually slotted into, but it's not a limitation, one of three categories. The first one is economic reasons, so this is generally the financial reasons. This may be due to a decrease in the demand or a sudden increase in expenses or anything that impacts on this sort of economic side of the business, the finances. This is the one that we see most often. The second category that we deal with as well is technological reasons, and this is where employees may be replaced with machinery or new machinery is being brought in where employees may need to adapt their skill sets to be able to use the specific machinery, but this impacts on their job and it is an operational requirement. The third one is structure. This is where businesses restructure, and this is where we most commonly get redundancies, where positions become redundant. So just a reminder that redundancy is a type of retrenchment whereby the person is being retrenched because their position has become redundant, i.e. meaning that position is no longer needed. Like I said, this usually happens when there's a restructure in the business. The tip or recommendation that I would like to share here is a reminder that whatever you put as the reason for these contemplated retrenchments or the contemplated dismissals, you would need to be able to prove this. So if asked to back this up with evidence, there would need to be evidence to back this up. Now, the one that I see quite often that is usually not able to be substantiated with actual evidence or information is where the reason is stated as cannot afford, meaning some version of the business can no longer afford these positions or these employees. And a word of caution that cannot afford generally means that the business is then insolvent, or the business is not able to continue financially. So if the retrenchment letter states that the business can no longer afford these employees, If asked, the financial statements, because the parties can request relevant information, which will then include the financial statements if that is the reason for the retrenchment, there would need to be some proof that the business really cannot afford these positions anymore. And cannot afford is quite a strong way of phrasing it and quite difficult to prove in most businesses, even if they are in extremely difficult financial positions. A more accurate way of phrasing this could be something like the expenses are no longer justified based on the trajectory of the business or based on the current demand for the products or based on a decrease in the turnover. So what we'd often do is include the last maybe 6 months turnover and show that there has been a decrease, or show that the general expenses, because sometimes the expenses are beyond the control of the employer. So things like a massive increase in rent or legislative changes that have resulted in a significant increase in the expenditure of the business, then we would detail those things. And instead of saying cannot afford, we would really be specific about this has been the increase in the expenditure and it doesn't make financial sense or it doesn't make business sense to continue to employ this many people based on the decrease in turnover or based on the increase of the expenses, etc. So the word of caution is just to try to stay clear of saying cannot afford. Moving on to the second one. Section 189(3)(b), the alternatives that the employer considered before proposing the dismissals and the reasons for rejecting each of those alternatives. My big request here to employers is to please not use generic templates received from consultants without adapting it to your specific scenario. Countless times where I have seen templates be used where there's a list of alternatives considered that are not relevant to the business at all, and when questioned, the employer would respond with, oh no, those were just on there, those are not really applicable to our business. Please only include things that were genuinely considered and that are applicable to your business. When using templates, it's very important to adapt them. Specifically, a document like this, it's very important to adapt it to your specific business circumstances. And even if there are no alternatives that you can think of, then simply state that there are no alternatives that you could think of. There is no legislative requirement that you must consider a specific number of alternatives prior to contemplating dismissals. Sometimes there really aren't any that you can think of, and that's fine. My assumption as to why this one is included in the letter is to give the information over to the consulting party to show what you have considered and why those are not viable options, and it saves time. It means that the consulting party isn't going to bring those suggestions to you because you've already laid it out and said, we looked at these are not viable options because of X, Y, and Z reason. So just remember, you have to include what the alternative consideration was and also why you rejected it. Some possible alternatives that I can think of off the top of my head would be things like temporary layoffs, doing a short time, hiring freezes, putting bonuses and increases or certain benefits on hold, other types of cost reductions, or alternative positions for the employees to take on. This usually happens in a restructure where there's a new need for certain positions where with a bit of skill adaptation, employees can become equipped to do those jobs. Although this is not a requirement, I think it is quite helpful to include any alternatives that were not necessarily rejected, but they were implemented, and they were implemented for some time, but they might not have resulted in enough of a change to prevent the contemplated dismissals. This firstly, again, speaks to the consulting party to know that those were already implemented and they didn't result in the necessary changes, but it also shows that there has been an effort from the employer side to attempt to prevent this from happening. Just a word of caution that the Act requires that the consultation process be starting when the employer contemplates dismissing any employees. That means starts to think about that there might be some dismissals that need to take place, and not when it has become so dire or so imminent that it needs to happen as soon as possible. And of course, if you're watching this video and you didn't start the process when it was contemplated originally, then you need to start it now. The idea behind that is just to allow sufficient time for the other party to come up with alternatives that could possibly mean less dismissals or some or other impact on the dismissal, such as the timing or mitigating the adverse effects, things like that. So the sooner you started, the better, because that does allow time for a meaningful consultation process and there is less of an urgency. In the Code of Good Practice on dismissals, it specifically speaks to how the process cannot be rushed as a result of the employer delaying starting the process. A final point on B is that I would recommend inviting the consulting party to bring any alternatives that they can think of that haven't already been implemented that might be viable options to minimize the number of contemplated dismissals. 189.3c. The number of employees likely to be affected and the job categories in which they are employed. The recommendation that I have here, or rather maybe it's a reminder, not a recommendation, is the selection criteria is one of the things that is discussed through the consultation process and cannot be preempted or pre-decided. That means that all employees likely to be affected need to be invited to consult, even if that means inviting 40 or 50 employees, whereby only 3 or 4 employees will actually be retrenched, because there needs to be consultation on how those 3 or 4 employees will be selected. And the mistake that I often see employers make is they preempt a selection criteria and then they only invite those specific employees. That is not in line with the Labor Relations Act. All of the employees that are likely to be affected must be invited to the consultation process and participate in the consultation process until that criteria, the selection criteria, has been agreed upon or finalized. How I see this play out is where the one branch might shut down, your business has lost a really big client and an entire branch was servicing this one client, and therefore the retrenchment is usually that branch or that team would be invited to the retrenchment consultation process. However, depending obviously on the skill set and the structure of your business, it might be that several branches working on different clients need to be invited to the retrenchment consultation process because the criteria might be something like LIFO, last in, first out. And that means that bumping would be applied, and that is where employees from other departments would be the ones that are retrenched and employees from this department will be moved to that department. So just a reminder to really include all employees that are likely to be or could possibly be affected by this process and to not preempt the selection criteria. And then also just a reminder to include their job categories. So often people will include the number but omit the job categories. Section 189.3d. The proposed method for selecting which employees to dismiss. So this is the criteria. This is the proposed criteria from the employer's side on selecting the employees to be dismissed. A reminder that this is a proposal which needs to be discussed through the consultation process, and specifically Section 189 states there needs to be firstly an agreed upon criteria, or if the parties cannot agree, the criteria needs to be objective and fair. The selection criteria for retrenchment can be quite complex, and I will probably make a video alone detailing all the different requirements around that and the complexity surrounding the selection criteria. But some details for this video is that the Code of Good Practice on dismissals due to operational requirements lists a couple that are generally the more accepted criteria, and it cautions against going against these. It's not to say you have to use one of these, it's just to say that these are generally accepted as fair and objective, and when you use ones that are not this, then you would need to be able to prove that they are objective and fair. And the ones listed in the Code of Good Practice on operational requirements is firstly, and also the one that I would strongly recommend if applicable to implement in your business, which is LIFO, last in, first out. So that is by length of service of the employees. The employees who have the shortest length of service would be the employees who are retrenched. The other two that are mentioned in the Code of Good Practice is to use skills and qualifications. So what a lot of employers do is they use LIFO but with keeping certain key skills and certain qualifications that need to be in the business that are crucial to the functioning of the business. But a reminder that that would need to be objective. It cannot be based on performance. It would have to be based objectively, skills and qualifications that are needed in the business. Section 189(3)(e), the time when or the period during which the dismissals are likely to take effect. Here you include a proposed time frame. Generally, we include possibly a month, 2 months from now, depending on the complexity or the urgency or the number of people likely to be affected by the process. There's no specific rule, not for a Section 189. There are rules for Section 189A, so refer to that if yours falls within that, which I will briefly discuss a little bit later in this video. Also, just a reminder that the retrenchment consultation process continues so long as the parties have points that they need to discuss, because it is only concluded when you reach a point of consensus or there are no longer points that can be discussed that are relevant or have an impact on the outcome of the consultation process. Therefore, it is very difficult. Often I will get phone calls where people say, but how long will it take? How many consultations will we need? And at best I can give an estimate, but the process continues so long as there are points that need to be discussed. This is again why I'm recommending that the retrenchment procedure be started as soon as employers contemplate dismissing employees, to allow sufficient time and to lessen the urgency that is required on the process or the pressure that's put on the process if it needs to be completed within a certain time frame. Of course, if that's not possible, then we make do with what we have. Section 189(3)(f), the severance pay proposed. The legislation gives the minimum severance pay that is required to be paid over. This is the severance pay proposed by the employer. That is not to say it needs to be the minimum. It can, of course, be more than the minimum. Most of the information related to dismissals for operational requirements is detailed in the Labor Relations Act or the Code of Good Practice on dismissals related to operational requirements. However, severance pay is detailed in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, specifically Section 41. The current minimum severance pay is 1 week for every completed year of service. However, if an employee is offered an alternative position and they unreasonably refuse this alternative position, then the employer is not obligated to pay severance. I'm sharing that for you to be mindful of it, but for a more detailed explanation of what is unreasonable, I will need to make a video dedicated to discussing what unreasonable would be. Section 189(3)(g). Any assistance that the employer proposes to offer the employees likely to be dismissed. As it states, any assistance that the employer is going to offer the employees if they are dismissed. A list of examples, and again, adapted as per your circumstances or as it is applicable to your business. And none of these are a requirement, they're just suggestions that I'm giving from my side. But the first one that we generally put on there is a positive reference letter. This just helps employees get a job. While a certificate of service is a legislative requirement, employers have to give employees a certificate of service. A positive reference letter is not a legislative requirement. Other types of assistance also includes possibly allowing the employees some time off during their notice period to go for interviews or to use that time to find other jobs, or not necessarily expecting them to work out their notice period, but still paying that notice month, which also gives them time off to find other jobs. Sometimes it includes assisting with CVs or helping employees to complete their LinkedIn profiles or helping them to join certain recruitment groups or other ways that can assist them to find another job. Again, these are not legislative requirements. These are simply suggestions from my side. Section 189(3)(h), the possibility of future re-employment of the employees who are dismissed. So here you would say, is it likely? Yes or no? How likely? And you just give a general estimate of whether or not it is likely. Under this section, we also generally include what we call preferential re-employment. This is where we state a proposed period of time that should a similar position become available or should the position of the company change such that new employees will be hired again, that the employees who were dismissed would be the preferred candidates so long as the positions are ones that they are fully qualified to do and they are still available to do them. Generally, the time frames that we attach to this is 6 months to a year, but there is no set time frame for that, and this is also something that is negotiated through the process. Section 189(3)(I), the number of employees employed by the employer. So this is simply the number of employees who are technically employees of the business. Do not include independent consultants or contractors here. This is only employees of the business. The reason that this is included is to determine whether it is a Section 189 or a Section 189A retrenchment. I'll discuss that in a moment. Section 189(3), this is the last point. The number of employees that the employer has dismissed for reasons based on its operational requirements in the preceding 12 months. Again, this point, similarly to the previous one we just discussed, is to determine whether it's a Section 189 or a Section 189A, i.e. a large-scale retrenchment. In the link below, I have included the criteria to determine whether it is a large-scale retrenchment. I'm not going to detail it in this video, but you can have a look there. If your retrenchment does fall into the category of a Section 189A, i.e. a large-scale retrenchment, I recommend including on the letter whether or not you applied to the CCMA to facilitate the process, or if you did not apply, to inform the employees of their right within 15 days of receiving the Section 189(3) letter. They can refer the matter to the CCMA to have the CCMA facilitated. There are specific conditions around that I'm not going to detail in this video today. And those are the 10 points that are a minimum requirement of what has to be on the Section 189(3) letter, the retrenchment letter. What I suggest including as well is, like I said at the beginning of this video, there are certain points that have to be discussed through the consultation process, and the Act specifically states that the point of the consultation process is to reach consensus on these points. Therefore, I recommend including these points, and you can find them under Section 189(2). So the consultation points are appropriate measures to avoid dismissals, appropriate measures to minimize the number of dismissals, appropriate measures to change the timing of the dismissals, appropriate measures to mitigate the adverse effects of the dismissals, and the method for selecting the employees, so that's the selection criteria that we spoke about, and finally the severance pay. This video is specifically dedicated to the Section 189(3) letter, the retrenchment letter, so I have not detailed extensively all of the requirements of a retrenchment, which I will do in another video in future, but just a reminder to read through the Act to see what the requirements are for the actual consultation process and how to go about conducting that process. But with the information received in this video, at least you can draft a proper Section 189(3) retrenchment letter to start the consultation off on the right foot. And then I suggest that you conclude your retrenchment letter by stating the date and the time and the place of the consultation, when it will be taking place. There is no set time frame for how long in advance an employee should receive notification for this consultation process, but just ensure that it is reasonable based on the complexity and how much information, so that they can prepare, and inform them that they have the right to be represented. And unlike other processes such as a disciplinary process, in a retrenchment, an employee can be represented by anybody of their choice. It is not limited to a trade union or to a fellow employee. It can be any person that they pick. Outside representation is allowed in a retrenchment process. And that concludes today's video. A reminder that you can use my template along with the information provided in this video to conclude your retrenchment letter, to start your retrenchment off on the right foot. If you found that this video was helpful, please remember to like it. And if you would like to see weekly content like this, subscribe to my channel.